For nearly 50 years, the world accepted the official narrative surrounding the final days of the king of rock and roll. But in 2025, a heavily restricted scientific initiative quietly gained access to preserved genetic material, setting off a chain reaction that few could have anticipated. When modern genomic testing and advanced forensic analysis were applied to long unseen samples, the results dismantled decades of accepted history. This was not just another routine look at old archives. The data uncovered microscopic anomalies and unexpected markers that forced leading experts to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about Elvis Presley. Join us as examine the breathtaking 2025 findings that changed the entire narrative and revealed a hidden reality. Why Elvis's DNA was ever examined in the first place. Biological samples connected to Elvis Presley have existed in various forms since his death in August 1977. That is not unusual for a death that involved an autopsy. The standard forensic process of examining a body to determine cause of death produces biological materials that are collected, tested, and retained as part of the official medical record. In Elvis's case, as in all cases where an autopsy is conducted, those materials became part of a documented chain of custody that has existed in some form for nearly 5 decades. What is unusual is the number of additional biological samples connected to Elvis that exist outside the official autopsy record. Hair samples collected by people who were close to him during his lifetime. Materials preserved by medical professionals who treated him across the years of his deteriorating health. Items retained by members of his household staff and inner circle, the Memphis Mafia, who understood even during his lifetime that objects connected to Elvis Presley carried significance that would only increase after his death. The universe of biological material potentially connected to Elvis is not small. The first serious scientific examination of Elvis-related biological material took place in the 1990s. It was not conducted by the estate. It was not authorized by Priscilla Presley or by any official body connected to the management of Elvis's legacy. It was conducted by private researchers working with materials that had come to them through channels that were, in some cases, less than fully documented. The specific focus of that early examination was the question that the conspiracy theory community had been asking since 1977, whether the biological materials being examined were consistent with being from the person who was officially identified as dying at Graceland on August 16, 1977. The examination produced results that were consistent with the official record. The biological materials were consistent with what was known about Elvis's biological profile at the time of his death. But consistent with is not the same as definitive, and the methodology available in the 1990s was not capable of producing the kind of definitive result that the question actually required. Additional examinations followed across the subsequent decades. Some were conducted with the involvement of the estate. Others were conducted independently by researchers who had obtained or claimed to have obtained biological materials through various means. The results of those examinations were similarly inconclusive in the specific sense that they confirmed what was already known without producing findings that advanced the understanding of Elvis's biology in any meaningful way. The technology was not adequate to the questions being asked. DNA analysis has advanced more dramatically in the past 3 decades than almost any other scientific methodology. What was possible in the 1990s is almost unrecognizable compared to what is possible today. The resolution available to modern genomic analysis, the ability to extract meaningful information from degraded biological samples, the capacity to answer questions about health, heredity, and biological history that previous generations of DNA science could not approach. By 2025, the gap between what science could do and what previous examinations had been able to establish was enormous. The estate's relationship to the biological material connected to Elvis has been carefully managed across the decades. Priscilla Presley, during her period of estate management, was protective of anything that could be characterized as Elvis's biological or medical record. Her concern was consistent with her broader approach to the estate. Information that complicated the managed version of Elvis's story was information that needed to be controlled carefully rather than made publicly available. That protectiveness was not without justification. The commercial value of Elvis's legacy depended significantly on the maintenance of a specific public image. Biological or medical findings that complicated that image could affect the estate's commercial position, in ways that had real financial consequences for everyone dependent on it. Lisa Marie's approach was similar in its practical outcome. She was more personally conflicted about the gap between the public and private versions of her father's story, but she did not authorize any significant new scientific examination of biological materials during her period of involvement with the estate. Riley's approach was different from the beginning. Her reassessment of the estate following Lisa Marie's death included a specific review of what biological materials connected to Elvis existed, where they were held, and what questions current scientific methodology might be able to answer that previous examinations had not been capable of addressing. That review was conducted quietly, not publicly announced, not discussed with journalists or with the broader community of Elvis researchers and enthusiasts. It was an internal process, Riley and a small team of advisors assessing what was available and what it might be worth examining, with the tools that 2025 science provided. The conclusion of that review was that a re-examination was warranted, not because the previous examinations had been inadequate given the technology available at the time. They had not been. They had done what the science of their era could do. But what the science of 2025 could do was categorically different, and the questions that 2025 science could answer were questions that had been sitting unanswered, sometimes unasked, for nearly 50 years. The biological sample selected for the re-examination was not from the autopsy record. That is a detail that has significance beyond the technical. The autopsy materials exist within a legal and bureaucratic framework that made accessing them for a privately authorized re-examination complicated in ways that Riley's team decided were not worth navigating for the initial examination. Instead, the sample used came from materials that had been in the estate's private possession, authenticated biological material connected to Elvis that had been collected and preserved during his lifetime through documented means. Hair samples, primarily, collected at known times during his life, authenticated through the chain of custody documentation that the estate maintained. The provenance of the sample was established clearly before the re-examination began. The team conducting the analysis was given documentation of the sample's origin and chain of custody before they began their work. They understood what they were working with. What they found when they applied the full capacity of 2025 genomic science to that material is where this story actually begins. What prompted the re-examination in 2025? The technology made it inevitable. That is the honest answer to the question of why 2025 was the year this happened, rather than any other year in the nearly 5 decades since Elvis died. The specific capabilities that modern genomic science brought to the re-examination did not exist in any previous year in a form that would have produced the findings this examination produced. The resolution available now. The ability to extract comprehensive biological information from samples that previous generations of analysis could only partially read. The capacity to answer questions about health history, heredity, and biological identity with a precision that 1990s or even 2010s technology could not approach. 2025 was the first year the science was genuinely ready for the questions being asked. But technology being available and someone choosing to use it are different things. Riley made the choice. Understanding why she made it in 2025 specifically requires understanding what she was carrying when she arrived at the decision. Lisa Marie had been dead for 2 years. The legal threat to Graceland had been resolved. The basement disclosure had been made. The tomb examination had been conducted, and its findings were being processed. Riley was in the middle of the most comprehensive reassessment of the Presley estate's relationship to the public record of Elvis's life that had ever been undertaken. She was asking questions that previous estate management had not asked, or had asked and decided not to pursue. The DNA question was one she kept returning to. What specific question was she trying to answer? This is where the story requires precision. The re-examination was not primarily motivated by the conspiracy theory question. Whether Elvis was who the official record stated he was, whether the biological materials were consistent with the person who died at Graceland in 1977 had been addressed in previous examinations to the degree that the previous technology allowed. Riley was not trying to answer that question again with better tools, though the re-examination did address it and produced a more definitive result than anything previously available. The primary question she was pursuing was about health. Elvis's medical history is one of the most contested aspects of his story. The official account acknowledges the pharmaceutical dependency that characterized his final years. The toxicology report from his autopsy documented the substances found in his system at the time of his death. The subsequent investigation into Dr. George Nikopoulos and the prescriptions he had issued produced a public record of the scale of the pharmaceutical intervention in Elvis's life that was significant. But the official account has always been partial. The specific medical conditions that underlay the dependency, the genetic factors that may have contributed to the health deterioration visible in his final years, the hereditary elements of his biology that shaped his susceptibility to the specific trajectory his health followed. Those questions were never fully answered, not because the answers were being deliberately withheld, because the science to answer them did not exist at the time of his death, and the subsequent examinations had not been designed to pursue them. Modern genomic science can address all of those questions with a level of precision that was not available in any previous era. There was also a family health dimension that Riley considered significant. Lisa Marie died of cardiac arrest at 54 years old. Elvis died of cardiac arrhythmia, classified as heart failure, at 42. Two generations of the same family. Similar cardiac events at ages that suggested something potentially hereditary in the family's biological profile. Riley is 45 years old. She is Elvis's granddaughter. She is Lisa Marie's daughter. The question of what the Presley family's biological heritage contains in terms of cardiac risk is not an abstract historical question for her. It is a personal medical one. Understanding Elvis's biology more completely with the tools now available could produce information relevant to living members of the family. Information about hereditary health factors that might inform medical monitoring and intervention for people who share that biological heritage. That personal dimension did not drive the re-examination alone, but it was present in Riley's thinking when she made the decision to proceed. The team selected to conduct the re-examination was chosen through a process that prioritized independence and credibility, not researchers with existing positions on Elvis-related questions, not scientists whose previous work had been connected to the estate or to the commercial enterprises built around Elvis's name. A genomics laboratory with significant published research credentials. Scientists whose primary work was in academic and medical contexts rather than in the forensic or celebrity-adjacent spaces, where previous Elvis-related examinations had been conducted. Their brief was specific, a comprehensive genomic analysis of the authenticated biological sample, addressing a defined set of questions that Riley's team had developed in consultation with medical advisors, producing a documented report of their findings that met the standards required for the results to be credible to the scientific community. The laboratory accepted the brief. The sample was transferred through documented channels. The analysis began in early 2025. Riley did not tell the public what was happening while the analysis was underway. That decision was consistent with how she had handled the tomb examination. The work happened first. The findings were understood and reviewed internally. Decisions about disclosure were made from a position of knowledge rather than anticipation. The analysis took several months. The report arrived at the estate in late 2025. Riley read it herself, as she had read the forensic report from the tomb examination. The people who were with her when she read it describe a reaction that was more visible than her response to the tomb examination report had been. Not distress, not shock in any dramatic sense. Something more specific. The specific quality of reaction that comes from reading something you had suspected might be true, and finding that the science has confirmed it in terms more definitive than you had expected. She sat with the report for several days before she discussed its contents with her team. When she did, the discussions that followed were among the most consequential the estate has conducted in years. What the scientists actually found. The laboratory's report opens with a section on methodology. 41 pages of the full document are dedicated to explaining precisely how the analysis was conducted before a single finding is presented. That proportion reflects something important about how the scientists approached the work. They understood that the credibility of whatever they found would depend entirely on the rigor and transparency of the process that produced it. A finding without a fully documented methodology is a claim. A finding supported by 41 pages of methodological detail is evidence. They were producing evidence. The sample analysis began with authentication. Before any genomic work was conducted, the laboratory independently verified the provenance of the sample using the documentation provided by the estate and through their own authentication protocols. The sample passed that verification. The biological material was confirmed to be of the age and origin consistent with the estate's documentation. The chain of custody was intact. The authentication finding was documented as a prerequisite to the analysis itself. That step was not procedural formality. It was the foundation on which everything that followed depended. Any finding produced from an unverified sample would be immediately dismissible. The authentication established that what the scientists were analyzing was what they were told it was. The genomic analysis that followed was comprehensive in a way that previous examinations of Elvis-related biological material had never been. Previous analyses had been targeted, designed to answer specific narrow questions. Typically, the question of whether the biological material was consistent with a known identity profile, yes or no, match or not match. This analysis was designed differently. It was a full genomic sequencing, the complete reading of the biological information contained in the sample, not targeted at specific questions, but designed to produce a comprehensive picture of the biological heritage, health profile, and genetic characteristics embedded in the material. That comprehensiveness was Riley's specific requirement. She did not want another narrow analysis that answered one question and left the rest of the biological picture unread. She wanted the full picture that 2025 science could produce. The laboratory delivered it. The first finding to emerge from the comprehensive analysis was the definitive identity confirmation. Previous examinations had produced results described as consistent with the official record. That language reflected the limitation of earlier technology. Consistent with is the answer you give when the methodology can establish similarity but cannot produce certainty. Modern genomic sequencing does not produce consistent results. It produces a level of biological identification that is as close to certainty as science currently allows. The sample was definitively identified as biological material from Elvis Presley, not consistent with, identified. That finding closed the identity question in a way that no previous examination had been able to close it. The science that existed in 2025 could produce a result that the science of any previous year could not. The conspiracy theory question, whether the biological materials connected to Elvis are actually from Elvis, now has a scientific answer of a quality that did not previously exist. The health findings were more complex and more significant than the identity confirmation. The comprehensive genomic analysis produced a detailed picture of Elvis's biological health profile, his genetic predispositions, his hereditary risk factors, the biological characteristics that shaped his susceptibility to the specific health trajectory his life followed. Several findings in this section of the report had not been previously documented in any public account of Elvis's health. The cardiac findings were the most immediately significant. The analysis identified specific genetic variants associated with elevated cardiac risk, variants connected to the family of conditions that involve abnormal heart rhythms and increased susceptibility to cardiac events. Those variants are hereditary. They pass from parent to child through the standard mechanisms of genetic inheritance. Elvis had them. The analysis documented their presence clearly. The specific variants identified are associated with a condition that medical literature describes as increasing the risk of sudden cardiac events, particularly under conditions of physical stress, pharmaceutical interaction, and the kind of sustained physiological pressure that years of performing at the level Elvis performed at, while simultaneously managing a significant pharmaceutical dependency would produce. The official cause of death, cardiac arrhythmia, is precisely the kind of event that the genetic variants identified in the analysis are associated with elevating the risk of. The genetic picture is consistent with the official cause of death in a way that goes beyond the general consistency previous examinations had established. It provides a specific biological mechanism that explains why Elvis's heart failed the way it did in a manner that no previous analysis had been able to offer. The pharmaceutical interaction findings were equally significant. The comprehensive genomic analysis included assessment of pharmacogenomic factors, the specific genetic characteristics that shape how an individual's body processes pharmaceutical compounds. Elvis's genetic profile includes variants that affect the metabolism of several classes of drugs. Specifically, variants that slow the processing of certain sedatives and opioid compounds. That create a biological situation where standard dosages of those substances produce effects in the individual that are stronger and more sustained than the same dosages would produce in someone without those variants. In plain language, Elvis's body, because of his specific genetic makeup, was more susceptible to the pharmaceutical compounds he was being prescribed than a person without those variants would have been. The doses that Dr. Nichopoulos prescribed were not calibrated to Elvis's specific pharmacogenomic profile. They could not have been. Pharmacogenomic testing of the kind that could have informed that calibration did not exist in the 1970s. But the genetic variants that made those doses more dangerous for Elvis specifically than they would have been for a different patient are present in the analysis and clearly documented. The hereditary implications were the finding that Riley had most personally anticipated. The cardiac variants identified in Elvis's genomic profile are hereditary. They pass through biological inheritance. The specific pattern of their inheritance means that direct biological descendants of Elvis have a meaningful probability of carrying the same variants. Lisa Marie was Elvis's only biological child. She died of cardiac arrest at 54. The analysis cannot determine whether Lisa Marie carried the same variants. That would require analysis of her biological material specifically. But the probability that she inherited them from Elvis, given the hereditary pattern of the variants identified, is significant enough that the finding has direct relevance to the medical history of everyone in the Presley biological line. Riley is in that line. The finding is not academic for her. It is personal medical information with implications for how she and any biological descendants of Elvis should approach cardiac monitoring and preventive care. The most unexpected finding in the report was in a section that Riley had not specifically requested, and the laboratory had not been briefed to investigate. During the comprehensive sequencing, the analysis identified genetic markers associated with a specific hereditary condition that has not previously been part of any public account of Elvis's health or his family's medical history. The condition is not cardiac in nature. It is a hereditary disorder affecting a different biological system entirely, one whose symptoms in their early and middle stages can produce effects that overlap significantly with the symptoms that were attributed to other causes in the accounts of Elvis's health during his final years. The laboratory flagged the finding specifically because it had not been asked about, and because its implications for the understanding of Elvis's health trajectory were potentially significant. Sources familiar with the full report describe this finding as the one that produced the most sustained discussion among Riley's team when the report was reviewed internally, not because it changes the fundamental picture of what happened to Elvis. The cardiac findings and the pharmacogenomic findings provide a complete enough biological account of why his health failed the way it did. But because it suggests that the deterioration observed in his final years was not entirely attributable to pharmaceutical dependency and lifestyle factors in the way the official account has always implied, there was a genetic component, a hereditary condition that was present and active and contributing to what people around him were observing without knowing what they were looking at. Nobody knew to look for it. The testing that could have identified it did not exist. But it was there. In 2025, science found it. What the findings changed. The report landed differently for different people. That is the first thing to understand about the impact of what the genomic analysis produced. There is no single answer to the question of what the findings changed, because what they changed depends entirely on what you believed before you encountered them. For the conspiracy theorists, the definitive identity confirmation changed nothing. The architecture of committed belief does not admit scientific evidence as a valid challenge. The finding was incorporated, dismissed, or reframed within existing frameworks in ways that left the underlying conviction intact. For the scientific and medical community, the pharmacogenomic and cardiac findings were the most significant. They provided a biological explanation for Elvis's health trajectory that previous accounts had been unable to offer at the level of genetic specificity the analysis achieved. For the public, the finding that changed the most was the one that had always felt most incomplete. The understanding of why Elvis died the way he did at the age he died. The official account has always had a gap at its center. cardiac arrhythmia. Heart failure at 42. Those words describe what happened. They do not explain why it happened to that specific person at that specific age, in those specific circumstances, in a way that felt complete. The pharmaceutical dependency filled part of the explanatory gap. The physical deterioration visible in his final years filled another part. The sustained physical and psychological pressure of decades of performing at the level Elvis performed at filled another part still, but gaps remained. Why did the dependency develop to the degree it did when other people prescribed similar compounds did not experience the same trajectory? Why did the physical deterioration accelerate so dramatically in the final years when Elvis was not significantly older than other performers who continued functioning at high levels? Why did the heart fail when it failed rather than earlier or later? The genomic findings answer those questions with a precision the official account never had. The pharmacogenomic finding is the most directly explanatory. Elvis's genetic profile made him more susceptible to the compounds he was being prescribed than a person without those variants would have been. The doses were not calibrated to his specific biology because the science to calibrate them did not exist in the 1970s. This does not absolve Dr. Nikopoulos. The prescriptions he issued were excessive by any standard. The quantity and combination of compounds he authorized for Elvis over the final years of his life reflected a failure of medical judgment that his eventual license revocation acknowledged. But the pharmacogenomic finding adds a layer that the official account of Nikopoulos's culpability did not contain. Elvis's body was processing those compounds differently than a standard biological response would have predicted. He was experiencing stronger effects from doses that might have been manageable in a patient without his specific genetic variants. The dependency and the deterioration it produced were accelerated by factors in his biology that nobody in his medical circle was equipped to identify. That does not make what happened to him less tragic. It makes it more specifically explicable. The cardiac variance finding changes the understanding of the cause of death in a different way. The official cause, cardiac arrhythmia, was always accurate as a description of the immediate event. The heart stopped beating in the specific pattern that sustains life. What the genetic analysis adds is the understanding of why that heart was predisposed to that specific failure mode. The variants identified are associated with conditions that, under stress, produce exactly the kind of arrhythmic event that the official record documents. The combination of those genetic predispositions with the pharmacological burden Elvis's body was carrying and the physical stress of the life he was living created a biological situation where the cardiac event that occurred was not random. It was, in retrospect, comprehensible in a way the official account alone never made it. Knowing that Elvis carried genetic variants associated with elevated cardiac risk does not change the facts of his death, but it changes how those facts are understood. It places them within a biological framework that had always been present but had never been identified. The hereditary condition finding is the one that changed the most for people closest to the story, not the public, the family. The identification of a hereditary condition whose symptoms overlap with the deterioration observed in Elvis's final years, a condition that was present and contributing without being identified, reframes the private experience of everyone who watched that deterioration happen. The people around Elvis in his final years, the Memphis Mafia, his household staff, his medical team, the people who saw him every day and watched a man they cared about diminish in ways that were attributed entirely to lifestyle and pharmaceutical dependency, now have a different context for what they observed. They were watching a man manage, without knowing it, a hereditary condition that had not been identified, whose effects were compounding the pharmaceutical dependency and the physical stress and the psychological weight of a life that had become genuinely impossible to sustain. He was not simply failing to take care of himself in the ways the public account has sometimes implied. He was also ill, in a specific genetically rooted way that nobody around him could see because the science to see it did not exist. That reframing matters, not as exculpation of the choices that were made, but as a more complete picture of the circumstances in which those choices were made. For Riley, the findings changed something personal. She authorized the re-examination partly because of the cardiac history in her family, her grandfather at 42, her mother at 54. The cardiac variants identified in Elvis's genomic profile are hereditary. the probability that Lisa Marie carried them is significant. The probability that Riley carries them is a question she now has a specific reason to investigate through her own medical care, in a way she did not have that specific reason before the analysis was conducted. That is the finding that changed something most immediately and most concretely, not for the historical record, for a living person's understanding of her own biology and what it might mean for her health. Riley has not spoken publicly about the personal implications of the cardiac findings for herself specifically. That is understandably private. But the reason she pursued the re-examination included this possibility, and the findings confirmed that the possibility was worth taking seriously. The finding that changed the public conversation most broadly was the identity confirmation. Not because the public had been committed to doubting it. The majority of people who follow the Elvis story had never seriously entertained the conspiracy theory that Elvis had faked his death. But the majority of people who follow the Elvis story had also never had access to a scientific finding of the quality that 2025 genomic analysis produced. Consistent with is different from identified. The language of previous examinations left a space, a technical gap between what the science could say and what certainty required. That gap was small for most people, too small to take seriously as genuine uncertainty. But it existed. And in existing, it provided the floor on which 50 years of conspiracy belief had rested. Modern genomic science removed that floor. The identity finding does not use the language of consistency. It uses the language of identification. Definitive, documented, produced by methodology that meets the standards that 2025 science establishes for biological identification. That language is different in kind from anything previous examinations had produced. And for people who had held genuine uncertainty rather than committed conspiracy belief, the difference in language is the difference between remaining open to a question and having that question answered. What the findings did not change is also important. They did not change the fundamental facts of Elvis's life and death. He was born in 1935 in Tupelo, Mississippi. He died in 1977 in Memphis, Tennessee. He changed American popular culture in ways that have not diminished in the nearly 50 years since his death. The genomic findings add biological specificity to the story of how he died. They add medical context that was always present but never identified. They add hereditary information that has relevance for the people who carry his biological legacy. They do not change what the music was, what the performances were, what the connection was between Elvis Presley and the millions of people around the world who loved him and have continued loving him across generations. Science changed the understanding of man. It did not change what the man had already given to the world. That was already given, already received, already embedded in the culture in a way that no scientific finding, however significant, touches. What this means, going forward, the report exists now. That is the fundamental change that the re-examination produced. Not just the findings it contains, the fact of its existence, a comprehensive genomic analysis of authenticated biological material from Elvis Presley, conducted by an independent laboratory using 2025 science, documented to the standards that scientific credibility requires. That document did not exist before Riley authorized the work. Now it does. And documents of that quality, once they exist, become part of the permanent record in a way that cannot be undone by anyone's preference for a different version of the story. For the historical record, the implications are significant and durable. Previous accounts of Elvis's health and the circumstances of his death were built on the documentation available at the time of his death and the examinations conducted in the years that followed. Autopsy records, toxicology reports, the accounts of people who were present, medical records from the physicians who treated him. Those sources are what they are. They document what the people who produced them could observe and measure with the tools they had. The genomic report adds a layer of biological evidence that those sources could not have contained. It explains mechanisms that the available documentation had always described in terms of observable symptoms without being able to identify the underlying biological causes. Future biographies of Elvis Presley will have access to this report. Future documentaries, future academic work on his life and death. Any serious account of Elvis produced after 2025 will engage with what the genomic analysis found and will present a picture of his health and his death that is more biologically complete than anything published before. That is a permanent change to the historical record. For the medical community, the pharmacogenomic findings have implications that extend beyond Elvis specifically. The variants identified in his genomic profile are not unique to him. They exist in the general population. People who carry similar variants are currently being prescribed similar compounds to those Elvis was prescribed in clinical contexts where pharmacogenomic testing is not standard practice. The Elvis case, because of its historical prominence and the quality of the documentation now associated with it, provides a specific and high-profile example of what pharmacogenomic mismatch can produce in a clinical context. An example that the medical community can engage with and reference in discussions of why pharmacogenomic testing should be more widely integrated into prescribing practice. Riley's team has indicated an intention to work with medical institutions to make the relevant findings available for research purposes in ways that protect appropriate privacy considerations, while allowing the scientific value of the data to be used. That intention, if it produces the partnerships it aims for, could have implications for clinical practice that extend well beyond the Presley estate and well beyond the history of Elvis himself. For the Presley family, the hereditary findings are the most immediately personal implications of the re-examination. The cardiac variants identified in Elvis's profile have a probability of being present in his biological descendants that the analysis documents specifically. Riley is the most directly affected living member of that biological line. She has not spoken publicly about what the findings mean for her own medical management. That is appropriately private. But the finding that the Presley biological line carries identifiable hereditary cardiac risk factors, documented now at a level of scientific precision that was not previously available, is information that has value for the family regardless of how it is managed publicly. Elvis's death at 42 and Lisa Marie's death at 54 both become more comprehensible and more preventable for future generations in the context of what the genomic analysis identified. That is the most personal meaning of the re-examination, and it is the one that Riley, who authorized it partly for this reason, has indicated matters most to her. For the public understanding of Elvis, the findings open a question that goes beyond the specific biological details. The question of who Elvis Presley actually was has been asked continuously since his death. Biographies and documentaries have approached it from every angle available: the music, the relationships, the Memphis Mafia world, the pharmaceutical dependency, the private life hidden behind the public performance. The genomic findings add a dimension that none of those approaches could reach: the biological dimension. The genetic inheritance that shaped what Elvis's body was capable of sustaining, how it processed the substances it was given, what cardiac vulnerabilities it carried, what hereditary conditions were present and active without being identified. Understanding Elvis's biology does not reduce him, it completes him. The public version of Elvis has always been built primarily on what he gave outward: the music, the performances, the charisma, the generosity, the tragedy. The genomic findings contribute to what was happening inward: the biological reality of a body under extraordinary pressure, carrying genetic factors that made that pressure more consequential than even the people closest to him understood. That inward picture does not change the outward legacy, but it adds something to the understanding of how the person who created that legacy was actually constituted. Riley has said publicly that the genomic findings will be incorporated into the estate's broader transparency effort, not released in full immediately. The full report contains information that has medical privacy implications for living family members, and that requires careful management to protect appropriately while making the historically significant findings available for public engagement. But the commitment to eventual comprehensive disclosure is consistent with everything she has done since Lisa Marie's death: the basement, the tomb examination, the genomic re-examination. Each of these represents a deliberate step toward the most complete public picture of Elvis Presley that honest custodianship can produce. Riley is not finished. She has indicated, in terms that leave little room for ambiguity, that there are additional disclosures planned. Additional materials from the private record of Elvis's life that will be made available as the estate's transparency program continues to develop. What those disclosures will contain is not yet public, but the pattern established by What has already been disclosed suggests that each new release will add something that the previous public understanding of Elvis did not contain. Elvis Presley was born on January 8, 1935, in Tupelo, Mississippi. He was the surviving twin. His brother Jesse Garon was stillborn. He grew up in poverty. He taught himself to play guitar. He walked into a recording studio in Memphis in 1953 and paid $4 to make a record for his mother. What happened after that is one of the most documented stories in the history of popular culture. And yet, 50 years after his death, a laboratory in 2025 was still finding things in his biology that the documentation had never captured, still producing findings that change the understanding of how a body can carry a legacy it cannot sustain. The music was always the most important thing. It remains so. But Elvis deserved to be understood completely. Not just what he gave the world, but what the world cost him. Not just the performances, but the biology that powered and ultimately failed to sustain them. The genomic re-examination is the closest science has come to that complete understanding. And Riley Keough, sitting with a 63-page forensic report and a genomic analysis that changed what she understood about her own family's biological heritage, is still building towards something more complete than any of it individually represents. The findings changed everything that needed changing. A $4 recording session took place in Memphis in 1953. Nearly 70 years later, in 2025, a biological sample was analyzed. Between those two moments lies one of the most examined lives in the history of popular culture, documented from every angle and studied by researchers, biographers, journalists, and fans across 5 decades of sustained attention. Yet, science still found something new. A genetic profile explains the cardiac vulnerability. A pharmacogenomic picture contextualizes the dependency, and a hereditary condition was present, contributing and completely invisible to everyone around him because the tools to see it did not exist. Elvis was not simply a man who failed to take care of himself. He was a man whose biology made the life he was living more dangerous than anyone understood. That does not change the music, as nothing ever could, but it completes the man. Riley Keough is still building toward the full picture. Subscribe and stay with us, because there is more coming.